Relations Council. I welcome you to today's book talk, which is one of a series of events where we interview authors of new books about China. So before we start, let me make a brief introduction of the Washington State China Relations Council and also mention our sister organization, the Washington State China Relations Fund. The Council is the oldest state-level organization dedicated to developing and improving relations with China. We were founded in 1979 after the visit of Deng Xiaoping when he came to Seattle, and the Council is a membership organization incorporating business, government, cultural and educational entities, as well as individuals with an interest in China. Our activities include promoting a balanced and nuanced dialogue regarding our relationship with China, consulting with state and local governments regarding their interactions with Chinese entities, and receiving delegations from China, as well as working on projects of mutual interest with our local Chinese community. Our sister organization is called the Washington State China Relations Fund. This is a charitable organization created to provide education about interactions between Washington State and China. The fund also supports charitable activities of importance to our local Chinese community. Examples of the fund's activities include sourcing and importing PPE that was donated to the state and the city of Seattle last year during the height of the pandemic. And we also solicited contributions to support local causes. Again, the fund is a 501c3, a charitable organization, so we do encourage donations to that so we can continue our work. One thing that both of our organizations do is create timely and informative webinars. We encourage you to look at our websites to see what new programs we have in the next coming weeks. Some of you may remember or may have known that we had scheduled a webinar titled Responding to Violence and Hate Crimes in the Asian Community, which was to be held last week. However, our webinar coincided with the announcement of the verdict of the George Floyd trial. So we decided, particularly as some of our panelists were pulled away, to postpone that event. We're planning to reschedule it in late May, so please check our website and our mailings so you can participate in that event. Now, moving forward to today's program. Over the past year, we've hosted a number of authors who have written books about China or about their experiences in China. We're very glad to welcome Sam Kaplan today, who's the author of Challenging China, and he's going to share his motivations about why he wrote this book and share with us some of the book's highlights. I'll note that the book was released only about 10 days ago. And I'm also glad that we have a very extremely talented, well-regarded journalist, Ann Tyson, who I hope is going to pose lots of tough questions to Sam. So let me just give you some brief bios. Again, you can look at our announcement or our website to see more. So the author, Sam Kaplan, is currently the director of the Center of Excellence for Global Trade and Supply Chain at Highline College. The center connects industry and education in Washington around workforce performance issues. Prior to Highline, Sam spent 20 years with the Trade Development Alliance of Greater Seattle. As president of TDA, Sam oversaw the organization of nearly a dozen outbound business trips and leadership missions. He helped lead the Global Cities Initiative. He was also instrumental in organizing the successful visit of President Xi Jinping of China, and he co-led the effort to create an international competitive strategy for Washington State. I'll also note that while he was president of TDA, Sam also briefly served as the interim president of the Washington State China Relations Council. So he has a long history with our organization. Earlier in his career, Sam worked as a legislative assistant for the now retired Representative John Miller. Sam is also a published author. He's been published in many journals, including the World Bank Urban Age magazine, and he also publishes a weekly newsletter called International Need to Know. Sam has also written and co-produced a short film about customer service called Please Hold, and he's the author of a novel, which I believe is based in Seattle, called Moonsrat Lives. So that's Sam, and our moderator today is Ann Tyson, and Ann is the Christian Science Monitor Beijing Bureau Chief, covering China and North Asia. Now you might find that a little strange, that she's based here in Seattle and she's the Beijing Bureau Chief. But from my understanding is she's not been able to get a visa from from the Chinese government to move to Beijing, so she has to cover China from Seattle. She's an award-winning journalist and author whose career includes a decade covering wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and 8 years as a foreign correspondent in China and Asia. In the U.S., she's covered the Pentagon, Congress, and the Midwest. And in addition to the Christian Science Monitor, she's reported for the Washington Post and contributed to the Wall Street Journal. Anna is also the author of a best-selling book about Afghanistan called American Spartan: The Promise, the Mission, and the Betrayal of Special Forces Major Jim Gant. She also wrote a book called Chinese Awakenings: Life Stories from the Unofficial China. Anne graduated from Harvard with an honors degree in government and East Asian studies and earned an honors certificate from the Institute of Political Science, or Sciences Po, in Paris. She was also awarded a fellowship for graduate studies in economics and business at Columbia, and she also received a Rotary Graduate Fellowship to study at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. So we're really pleased we have these two distinguished persons to speak to us today. So just before we get started, let me bring up some housekeeping notes. Anne is going to lead a discussion with Sam. The two of them will talk for about 30 minutes. After that, we'll open it to audience Q&A. You can put your questions into the chat box, and we're going to try our best to get to all your questions. Please do keep yourself on mute throughout all the session. And I'd like to note that we are recording today's session, and if you want to review it later or recommend it to your friends, it will be available on the Washington State China Relations Council YouTube channel. We'll post the link, there it is. Well, the link is showing up right now in the chat box, and it'll take us approximately 24 hours to get it up, so you won't see it till maybe this time tomorrow. So, no more introductory notes. Let's get on with the show. So Anne, I'll turn it over to you, and we look forward to a good session.
Thanks so much, Nora. And good afternoon, everyone. Thanks to Nora and the council for inviting me to discuss this really thought-provoking book. And unlike what Nora suggested, I'm going to start off with a softball question, which is, I really want to know a little bit more of the backstory. So Sam, what inspired you to write this book?
Thanks, Anne, and thanks, Nora. And I've been a longtime reader of the Christian Science Monitor, so it's a delight to talk with you. And I happen to think the Washington State China Relations Council is one of our state's great organizations, and under Nora and Mon, in my humble opinion, is doing better work than ever. So thanks to you all. Why did I write the book? Like a lot of people dealing with China, I became increasingly concerned over the last 8 years by the direction China was headed under Xi. And like a lot of people, I assumed China, as it developed economically, would slowly liberalize, sort of like Taiwan and South Korea and other countries have done. But I was wrong. In fact, China's done the exact opposite. It's become more authoritarian. And then as opportunity arose, due to America's ceding world leadership the last 4 years under the Trump administration, China became increasingly expansionist as well. And I don't mean necessarily geographically. They have done that some in the South China Sea. You know, the borders that China claims in the South China Sea, some of them are 1,000 miles away from their actual shores. It's a little bit like Portland, Oregon saying Chicago is part of Portland, or saying that they invented deep dish pizza or something. It's, there's a little bit of geographic expansionism, but really what I'm talking about is they're trying to change the post-World War II, post-Cold War, evolving liberal rules-based order into one that would, what I call, making the world safe for authoritarianism. I write, as Nora noted, a weekly international need to know newsletter, and have been doing it for a number of years now. I think if you went back and read my stories from the early part of that newsletter, it's probably changed what I've written about China and how I've written about China as I became more and more concerned what was going on over there. And then in the fall of 2019, my wife and I traveled to Italy to celebrate our wedding anniversary. And while we were there is when the Daryl Mori Hong Kong tweet occurred, when he wrote a tweet. Daryl Mori was the general manager of the Houston Rockets NBA basketball team. He tweeted support for the Hong Kong protesters. And China, in typical fashion, brought the hammer down, banning NBA telecasts in China and making all sorts of threats. Don't usually watch TV when I'm on vacation, but in the pension in Sorrento where we're at, they happen to have the TV on in the cafeteria or in the little dining room there. And so that was being covered extensively. And as I was watching it, I disagreed with a lot of the policy responses people were suggesting, and with the suggestions that people had of what to do, whether it was hawks or doves on China. I didn't really agree with what was being said. So on the train ride to Rome for Sorrento, I started to write down my ideas. And then in Rome, one night we were at a rooftop bar in our hotel, beautiful setting. My wife and I were splitting a bottle of Montepossiano wine. My wife is reading to get ready for what we're going to do the next day in Rome. And I essentially outlined the whole book in that hotel bar on the rooftop in Rome. So that's really how the book came together. And then I had to write it after outlining it, of course. But the basic idea for it came from that.
Wow. Well, that's a great story. And I noted that you devoted several pages to LeBron James's statements made during that NBA controversy. So just for potential readers, there's a very interesting segment on that. But I wanted to ask how, about another anecdote where you launch off the book and you talk about President Xi Jinping's visit to Seattle in 2015 with an anecdote that to you is very important as an illustration of China's current path. So could you share that? And I thought it was a great anecdote.
Thanks. So yeah, glad to. Yeah. So when I call it sort of the great escalator incident of 2015, I was part of the host committees that organized the visit of both Xi Jinping to Seattle in 2015 and also Hu Jintao when he came in 2006, I believe it was. And really the differences in the two visits reflected the changes taking place in China and definitely affected my thinking on what was happening in China. So when she came, there was a big gala dinner at the Westin Hotel in downtown Seattle, and I helped organize it. And there were a set of escalators in the lobby of the hotel that Chinese security wanted turned off for the entire duration of Xi's stay there. But that would have been against the fire code and against the law, in fact, and they were told no, and that there were security measures in place to protect Xi and a bunch of other dignitaries that were in the hotel. So the day of the dinner that afternoon, I happened to be walking by. It was before the dinner, but there were meetings taking place already in the hotel. And I happened to be walking by the escalators and they were turned off. And then I saw the head of the U.S. Secret Service nearby. He came up to me and said, yeah, the Chinese security physically turned off the escalators. We decided it wasn't worth the fight. Well, let's keep them off for the next half hour or so. So China was becoming more assertive. They were willing to buck law, common sense, and even the U.S. Secret Service on these things. Now in 2006, during Hu's visit, early on, Hu's advance team, they were asking for suggestions on what to do and when to do it. They even wanted to know, okay, how can we avoid rush hours so we don't disrupt your lives? And their advanced teams early on, the ones who came early on at the lower level Hu advanced teams, they were empowered to make decisions. But when Xi came in 2015, they told us what to do. They did things when they wanted. They didn't care about Seattle traffic. In fact, he went during rush hour and caused a big traffic jam. And really no decisions were finally made until Xi's inner circle came about 5 days before the trip. China was quickly becoming a different place. It's become more oppressive, more closed, and more expansionist. And I think that's a bad combination for the world. And the two trips really brought that out for me and really illustrated for me and made me understand it better. You read about things, but it's always interesting to see it up close.
Yeah, that's great. And yeah, so just that contrast was something that impressed upon you, changes from one sort of administration to another. I'd like to turn a little bit to just a recent headline, which is China's very enviable growth rates. But another thing that you highlight in the book is that you see economic headwinds on China's horizon. Can you talk, I mean, that's such a fundamental aspect of the country. Can you talk a little bit about your pessimism on China's economy?
Yeah, so they do face economic headwinds. China has had incredible economic growth, as we all know, over the last 40 years. And frankly, I think they should be applauded for it. It's helped bring, 700 million people out of absolute poverty. So it's not something to criticize, it's something to celebrate. But under current trends, China's population in the next 20 years will be older than the United States. There's too many Chinese that look like Nora and me and not enough that look like our children. So it's one of the reasons why their economy has slowed, and I don't think it's going to grow at the rate it has previously. We have to remember that economic growth, GDP growth, comes from two things: an increase in the working age population and an increase in productivity. Well, China's working age population, it's already declining, and trends for birth rates have actually gotten worse in the last few years, not better. So their demographic situation is actually worsening. China's demographics are going to age even more than what was previously projected. In fact, late last night in the Financial Times, there was an article that China is set to announce that their latest census figures will show that they have the first decline in population since the 1950s, not decline in working age population, but decline for the whole population, the first time since the 1950s. The Global Times, one of China's official newspapers, refuted that, but they did say the decline would be coming in 2022. So whether it happened last year or the next couple of years, they're now going to have declining population. I might note that there's the University of Washington's Institute for Health Metrics projects that by the year 2100, China's population will only be, it's like 731 million or something like that, 732 million. And this is obviously way into the future. A lot of things could change this, but under their current projections, and that's using birth rates before these latest birth rates that are now lower, China would actually be smaller than Nigeria in the year 2100. China's now trying to increase the birth rate, but so have a lot of other East Asian countries trying to do that, and none of them have succeeded. In fact, no countries around the world have tried to increase their birth rates have really been successful. So I don't think there's any reason to think that China will be successful when the others weren't. So let's look at productivity. If you know, then I'll finish up. Sorry, the productivity.
No, please.
Productivity. China's had higher productivity increases than other developed countries, but those increases have been decreasing. So they're not getting the same productivity increases that they had previously. And even currently, each Chinese worker produces far less than a South Korean worker, a Japanese worker, an American worker, a Mexican worker, and many other workers around the world. Some people like Nicholas Lardy think that they can easily increase their worker productivity because China has very low levels of education. I argue in my book that even if they are able to do that, it really won't increase their productivity or the economy that much. And that'll also, I think it'll be difficult to do. So China's had remarkably high GDP growth rates over the last 40 years. But I think going forward, their GDP growth is going to be more similar to the US and EU than what they did in the past. And that of course, is going to have all sorts of social, economic, and political implications.
Yeah, and I think you talked also about in your book about some of the challenging decisions because, for example, if they want to raise the retirement age or encourage people to work longer, this may not be the most popular policy. So it's not as though there's nothing they can do, but will they, because it might risk being unpopular. In my own reporting on that topic a little bit, I have understood that it's quite difficult to turn around this trend. I mean, they have discussed allowing more childbirth, opening it up completely, but demographers don't really think that will make a huge difference. And one reason is that Chinese women are getting into the workforce and they simply don't want to have huge families or necessarily a lot of children. So that is a really interesting trend to watch going forward. So just turning to another topic, and you alluded to this in your introduction, but you use the word expansionist to describe China today and saying that Beijing is using its economic influence to change the current rules-based international order to better serve its interests. Now, of course, some would argue that this is to be expected from a rising power. And you see it as a threat, not only to the world, but ultimately to China itself. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, and I agree. It should be expected of a rising power, especially one of both the population size and the economic size of China. And I don't argue that as a general principle we should stop large countries with economic power from having more influence on the world order, except that the problem is that China, if China was a liberalized country, we should be really welcoming and encouraging their having greater influence. But they're not, as we talked about earlier, that they've become more authoritarian than they were before, both in terms of how they treat information, freer society, treatments of minority populations, treatment of women. You talked about women being more in the workforce, but there's still a lot of discrimination against women in China. In fact, there was a burgeoning feminist movement in China that's really been completely squashed the last 2 or 3 years. There's a good book called Betraying Big Brother by think the author's name is Lita Hong. It's an excellent book if you want to find out what's been happening to the feminist movement in China. But anyway, in most areas and by most measurements, China is growing more authoritarian. And then, as I talked about earlier, they're trying to change what I call the post-World War II, post-Cold War, liberal world, rules-based order, which admittedly was flawed and needs to continue to evolve, but what has been evolving over the years, or at least until maybe about 4 years ago. And China wants to make that order into one that's safe for authoritarianism. And I give an example in the book, among many, of the United Nations International Telecommunications Union, the ITU. That name sounds like it would be used to help insomniacs get to sleep. It's not the most exciting name you're ever going to hear. But China is actively using this organization to propagate facial recognition technology standards onto the world. The ITU is in charge of those kinds of standards around technology for the world. It's, by the way, the oldest international organization in the world. It used to be the International Telegraph Union. So they have responsibility for standards for global communications technology. China's gotten key people into that organization, or trying to change those standards to benefit the ways that you can track your citizenship. And then, of course, China's also exporting that technology to developing country governments to help them use that technology on their own citizens or oppress their own citizens. And so the UN International Telecommunications Union is not as boring as it sounds. It's very important. And they're doing that across many different international organizations. They're trying to change the various, what we have previously, the world order organizations, into things that'll make life easier for China and really life easier for authoritarianism. So that's my concern. And then for China, ultimately, I think it's bad because, as I'm sure there's plenty of complaints to be had about the rules-based world order, but it was rules-based, and there's ways to work with it, and we could have continued to evolve it, and also made for a more efficient world economic system. Well, we'll have less efficient economies, so growth will be less, and that's bad for China, as well as, of course, for the Chinese people who are living under oppression and then living in a world that will be more authoritarian. Ultimately, I think it's bad for China to change the rules-based order into one that's more capricious. I think it's bad for the whole world, but I also think it's bad for China.
Yeah, that's interesting. Thanks for that final point. So for the benefit of the audience, I'd like to just step back a little bit and ask you to summarize your recommendations for China's strategy. And as like a second part to that question, how does the policy that you recommend differ from the past engagement strategy that was followed for many decades, as well as the more recent moves towards decoupling from China?
Sure, yeah, it's complicated, right? So I won't go into detail in this part, but I will say that my book also says that the most important thing we need to do to deal with China is to improve our own country. And I give a variety of suggestions on how to do that, but I'll let people read the book to learn about those. I do put in many ideas in the foreign policy realm of what we should do. One is I recommend elevating human rights as a tool of our foreign policy. And I go into detail in the book about how that's been effective in the past under both Carter and Reagan. I try to bring Carter and Reagan fans together, which may be a difficult thing to do. And also in ways it's been done problematically as well. But I talk about how we can use human rights to make things to be more effective. And I also point out, though, that whenever we try and bring up human rights, China will say at least two things. One will say, well, this is an internal matter for China. And then second, they'll say, well, who is America with its racial inequality problems to be talking to China about these issues? On the first point that China brings up, I'll quote from my book, determining the rate of a capital gains tax is an internal affair. Debating the best route for a new high-speed rail line is an internal matter. The torture of Zumrat Dawood, who's a Uyghur, is a matter for the whole world. And then on the second point, Biden and other public officials in the US and in other countries, they can preface every time they talk about human rights with China, they can preface it with a statement that, yep, we have issues in our own country to deal with and we need to deal with them. But that does not excuse imprisoning over 1 million Uyghurs and forcibly sterilizing women. So I think human rights is a landscape where it's both a moral thing, but also it's a place where there's a strategic advantage because of what China's been doing. In terms of decoupling, I do not believe in general decoupling from China. First, there's no evidence that it works. If decoupling was so effective, then Cuba would be a liberalized democracy by now, right? Or North Korea would be a liberalized democracy. And I could give many other examples of countries where America or other parts of the world have tried to decouple from them and it has not been effective. But also, I don't think it's realistic. China is far more entwined in the world economy than the Soviet Union ever was, for example. It would be very challenging for American companies and the American economy to decouple from China. There's lots of, even with all the challenges of mercantile system in China, there's plenty of companies selling into China as well as importing from China. And really, if you want to decouple, if just America decoupled from China, all you'd be doing is ceding the economic landscape to other countries. So really what we'd want to do is make it multilateral. Well, that would be even more difficult to do. And I don't think it's realistic, in addition to not being effective. I do call for selective strategic decoupling when it makes sense. I think Huawei is a good example. There's no reason why a country, including America, should be using Huawei components in our telecommunications networks. And there's probably other examples as well. I also think it'd be good to develop worldwide regulations on transparency and data privacy so you can deal with issues like TikTok and other ones. I don't think it'll happen, but I do think we should try to rejoin the Trans-Pacific Partnership. That was the trade agreement among Asian Pacific nations that the Trump administration pulled out of. And since then, the rest of those countries kept going with it. So there is a TPP, it just does not have the United States in it. And then China's negotiated a trade agreement with other Asian nations, ASEAN. I also think we should start using the WTO again. And this is something, as I was writing the book, that I changed my mind about as I did research. I originally went into the book thinking, well, WTO is not really that effective and had a lot of problems. But as I did the research, and there's a great paper by, I forget his first name, I think the last name is Wu at Harvard University, that really shows that a large percentage of the complaints brought at the WTO were against China. And in fact, countries won a lot of those complaints, and China took some measures to deal with the rulings. I don't think they were fully effective, and it's not like WTO is going to turn China into a non-mercantile, liberalized country tomorrow, but it's another tool that we could use, and I think we should start using it again. And maybe just briefly, I also call for welcoming Chinese students and immigrants. There's certainly Chinese spies in the country, but the overwhelming number of Chinese who are here as students or workers or otherwise are not spies. And ultimately, I think we should have confidence that an open society is more successful than a closed one. So yes, let's root out the spies, but let's treat Chinese immigrants well, and let's encourage more of them to come. And I know Nora, they had to postpone the program. I'm looking forward to attending that program in May. The racism that's come out of some of those types of efforts against immigrants is a big problem in itself, and it's also dumb strategically if you're trying to deal with China.
Thanks for that. That's a great summation. One of the main ideas that you propose is that the U.S. and other democratic countries should work together to actively promote economic opening and political liberalization in China. But how do you see that happening, especially in the context of the nationalism and the very significant support that the CCP enjoys in China among the population today?
Yeah, it's a great question. And again, I don't think what we do is going to overnight change China into liberalized society. I'll get into the point about the support for the CCP in China here in a minute. But yeah, the multilateral approach, I think, is the best way to push back against China's economic and political coerciveness. The US has concerns about China, but guess what? So do a bunch of other countries. In China, as I said earlier, they tell us not to interfere in their internal matters, but they have no qualms interfering in other countries' internal affairs. Sweden, for example, learned this when they decided to give a literary award to a Swedish citizen, Chinese born, but a Swedish citizen who had been writing critically of China. And China threatened them very severely over that. And they've threatened many other countries over a variety of different things over the years. So lots of other countries have concerns about China. In fact, over the last 4 years, China has become much less popular. I think Xi's policies and efforts have actually backfired on China. And of course, American companies aren't the only ones dealing with IP theft, forced technology transfer, and closed markets in China. All countries' companies face these same mercantile problems. But it is not going to be easy to do a multilateral effort to push back against China. We need to understand that. We need to work on it, but not all countries are going to agree on all things or on tactics or on how to do it. Plus, there's going to be commercial pressure against them. There was a recent survey of German companies, and 72% of them are planning further investments, and I think it's 77% are expecting the Chinese market to do better than other markets. And then you think a couple of weeks ago, the Swedish retail store H&M, they'd had on their website for quite a while a statement that they were not going to use cotton made by forced labor in Xinjiang. That caused them to become persona non grata in China, and they actually took down that statement from their website. So for commercial reasons, it's very difficult to do a multilateral approach. But one key to the multilateral approach is what it is we want to accomplish and what should be the focus of it. Under the Trump administration, which didn't do anything multilateral at all, but what they were obsessed with was the bilateral trade deficit. Human rights and even opening up the Chinese economy were way secondary concerns, if concerns at all. And then there's other policymakers who their goal is to have America always be more powerful economically than China and in other ways than China. And I don't think that's what we should be trying to accomplish. Other people are talking about we're trying to compete with China. Really what we should be trying to do is to encourage China to liberalize politically and economically. If China is more liberal politically, more liberal economically, they, like we said earlier, they should have more influence on the world. And there's a lot more people in China than the United States, and hopefully they do grow economically. And so more people, there's a lot of people gotten out of absolute poverty, but there's a lot of other types of poverty in China. It would be good for the world if they developed and reduced that poverty. And if they become bigger than we are economically, that's fine. What we want, again, is for them to liberalize politically and to liberalize economically.
So the Biden administration just marked its first 100 days in office. How would you critique their approach towards China so far in the context of your recommendations?
Well, even as the Biden administration they're still getting organized, right? And they're conducting, I believe, a strategic reassessment of our dealings with China. But even so, they've actually, in my opinion, and from my point of view on human rights, I think they've been admirably upfront about human rights so far. In fact, Secretary Blinken, the Secretary of State, he's even gone so far as to call what's going on in Xinjiang a genocide. And this, by the way, is a legal definition under the United Nations. There's a convention on the prevention of genocide under the UN. So there's actually a legal definition for it. A lot of people think, oh, you're just calling it genocide because you want to call it genocide, and there's nobody being sent to gas chambers and everything. But there's actually a legal definition, and some people think that China meets the criteria under that definition. So I think the Biden administration so far has been relatively upfront talking about human rights, and they've been carrying on the Trump's efforts on basically treating Taiwan as a country, which of course Taiwan is a country and really a successful one by just about any definition and measure. And they've been trying to build multilateral efforts. The Prime Minister Suga from Japan was here, and when he was here, China was one of the big subjects. I think they're having a summit with Europe later this year, and I'm sure China will be a big part of that. They've been talking to a lot of folks, so they're trying to build a multilateral effort. But I will say that's also where they've had their biggest failure so far, or they're now trying to reverse course. The shunning of India and not helping them with the surge in COVID-19 cases, that was a moral and humanitarian failing. But I also think it was the first major foreign policy failure of the Biden administration. In fact, I believe it could have been almost as damaging as anything the Trump administration did. And the Trump administration did a lot of damaging things. They fortunately over the weekend have reversed course, but I think some of the damage was already done. But it was a really boneheaded thing to do from a whole bunch of different perspectives, including a foreign policy perspective. You know, America needs to understand we're in a very different world than in 2016 when Biden was vice president. As I said earlier, we ceded world leadership. China became stronger and more assertive, and other countries, they took steps to adapt to a non-US led world. You've seen, I think it's India, Australia, and Japan have formed a supply chain coalition. You see Vietnam and Japan's defense ministers meeting to try and deal with security measures there. We're not, we can try and exert leadership, but we're doing it in a different milieu than it was previously. And the COVID pandemic has been a great teacher in that, you know, no country really gets out of the pandemic until all countries get out of the pandemic. And the vaccines that saved us, they were developed by worldwide scientific cooperation. And even the Americans that were involved, they were often immigrants. And the ingredients for the vaccines come from all over the world. So we need to recognize that and act accordingly.
Okay, great. Well, I think it's about time for me to turn to some questions that are coming in from our listeners. And this is from Dory Jones Yang. How well did the US follow the rules in the rule-based order? Didn't we write them to reflect our values and ignore them when we didn't like them?
Yeah, I've heard that argument a lot, including from folks in China, but also folks from outside of China. So as I said, the rules-based order was not perfect, and certainly the US had influence on it as the leading economic power and military power, but they weren't written just by us. That is not accurate. Lots of other countries had influence on it, including Europe and other places. And it was rules-based. And it was rules-based in a way that it could evolve and had been evolving and hopefully would have evolved some more. So I get there's complaints and concerns about the rules-based order, but I don't think, and the United States certainly did not obey all the rules in many different ways, including when we invaded Iraq the second time and a whole bunch of other ways. But again, it's a rules-based order, and I don't want to have an order that's created by an authoritarian country that will be much more capricious than the other one. I think a lot of times, not just in this area, but in every area, we always just want to complain about things in isolation, and rather than asking, this is not working great, but in compared to what? So you have to compare it to different alternatives. And the other thing to think about is the last 70 years have been one of the most successful, probably the most successful era in human history. We talked about poverty has gone down in China, but it's gone down all over the world. It's also gone down in America during that time. And for all races and ethnicities, it's gone down. There's still a big wealth gap, but poverty has gone down. Literacy is up all over the world. Non-COVID-19 vaccines are up all over the world. Child mortality is down all over the world. That happened in a post-Cold War, post-World War II, rules-based liberal world order that I think had a big contribution to all of that happening. And throwing it away into the dustbin of history is a mistake.
Thanks. So another question from Dory Jones Yang. Is the disproportionate incarceration of Blacks in the United States an international human rights affair?
In fact, an international association of lawyers yesterday called it a crime against humanity. So yeah, I have no problem with that. I think that it is a problem. So again, what the United States does with its tax rates, or if we decide to spend much money in infrastructure, those are internal matters. But things like incarcerating Blacks at a much higher disproportion, and frankly, imprisoning people of all races at a much higher proportion than other parts of the world, I have no problem with the rest of the world talking about that and prodding us to change that. I think it's also worth noting that incarceration rates have been coming down rapidly over the last, I think, 10 years. And for Blacks, they've been coming down at a much higher rate than they have for whites. So there's been improvements being made, but certainly a lot more ways to go. And actually, I'm gonna take back the lawyers group wasn't talking about incarceration rates. They were talking about the killing of Blacks by police. And I have no problem with their doing that as well. Happy to talk about that. And I can talk about that and still have room to talk about the human rights abuses in China. And so definitely let's prod the United States to improve ourselves, and let's prod China to improve itself. And what China is doing is a big problem, and people should be addressing it.
Okay, a question from Edward Alden. What do you make of the argument that China sees the United States as facing inexorable decline? Does that increase the likelihood that China will try to challenge US resolve, for example, over Taiwan?
Well, I think China does think that America is in decline. There's a couple of quotes I won't be able to remember, but Xi Jinping in some recent speeches has intimated that, as well as a respected academic in China. And it's not just China. I think other countries think that America is in decline, and I don't necessarily blame them. And think about the January 6th insurrection. We had people in fur hats invading the U.S. Capitol. So I think the China and other parts of the world thinks that America's in decline. Now, whether we are or not is another question, or whether it's going to continue if there has been a decline is another question. But I think it has had an effect on China's foreign policy. I think that's one of the reasons why they've become more assertive and continue to be assertive. People talk about the wolf warrior diplomacy, and I think that's one of the reasons why they have been more assertive. I also think that's actually backfired on them, and they're finding it's very difficult to be a top dog in the world, and people are going to complain to you and not just follow what you want to do, as America found also the last 60, 70 years. So I think it's a double-edged sword for them. In regards to Taiwan, China's been doing a lot more invading airspace of Taiwan, even in the last number of months. They've certainly made stronger statements on Taiwan. Whether the perceived decline of America means that they're going to invade Taiwan, I don't know. I'm not a military expert. I do think we should be supporting Taiwan and helping them so they can defend themselves. I don't know that. I don't know if China is going to invade Taiwan right away. I do worry that they know that they've got demographic decline, that they have China challenges, and maybe that there's a possibility that would speed up their wanting to invade Taiwan, because they may not be as strong 5 or 10 years from now as they think they are now. But I don't know. It's a great question. I think in my book I wrote "I don't know" a number of times, and here's another place where I don't know.
Yes, I thought that was a great pattern that you had to sort of say, I'm going to say when I don't know something every place, 7 times or 8 times in your book. In any case, another question from Lilu Porter. A comment: women have been working in the last 70 years in China, and so it's getting back to the population issue. Wouldn't productivity come from technology improvement, i.e. automation, versus human population growth?
Oh yes, that's another way to increase productivity, and we'll have to see. So there's a lot of people who've been talking about the great stagnation technology-wise in the world for the last 10, 15 years. And productivity increases are way down all over the world, including in the United States. And technology, we think, oh, all these great things, here we are all talking on Zoom, but it hasn't been reflected in technology productivity. Now, there's some people now think we're now on the verge of changing that due to some new technology that's coming along, including clean energy technology. Solar power has become so cheap, that'll be great for the environment, but having cheaper than what we've had power also could open up a variety of new technologies and new industrial things and increase our productivity. So I think China could benefit from technology increasing their productivity, but that would be spread all over the world as well. So I don't know that they'll have more rapid productivity increases in other parts of the world because of it.
Okay. All right. There's sort of a string of questions from Rick New, and I'll read all of it, but I think you can. There's sort of a couple of questions in these comments. As a starting point, do you think the United States ignores and denies, or recognizes and accepts the rise of China? And do you agree that the train has left the station, meaning China's rise is unstoppable, and the United States must prepare to coexist with an equal or stronger power. Then sort of the second part is, most of your viewpoints seem in sync with the Biden administration's thinking. Any areas of difference that transcend party lines? And in your view, should we as a country form policy continuity on China?
It's a lot of good questions.
Yeah.
So the first one, I guess, remind me what the first one was again. Sorry.
The first one is just, do you think the United States, well, I don't know if
whether we should accept that they're going to inevitably be rising and whether we should accept it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so I guess I would frame it differently. I don't think that our problem should be that China is developing economically. So if that's what we mean by China's rise, per se, I think what our problem should be, as I said earlier, is that China can use that economic leverage and they're not becoming less authoritarian, they're becoming more, and now they're trying to propagate that authoritarianism onto different orders of the world. So that to me is the problem. So I think we should always accept other countries growing economically, even if we need to push back against their economic mercantilism, their closed economy, their forced technology transfer, keeping different parts of the economy closed and everything. But again, I don't think it's bad for economies to grow. I think it's good for economies to grow. It brings people out of poverty. There's no reason why I should care less about somebody in Yangzhou who's impoverished and having a difficult life than somebody in South Seattle having a difficult life. They're both equal human lives. I'm not a nationalist in that sense. But I don't think their rises and their continued rise is inevitable. As I said, they have economic headwinds, and then politically they've been very assertive, but they're also finding that is causing them more difficulties geopolitically. People are pushing back against it. So I guess I'd frame it differently than they did. What was the second question? I'm sorry.
Then the second part of that is, most of your viewpoints seem in sync with the Biden administration. So do you have differences from their stance? And should we strive for policy continuity on China? I think he means between different administrations.
Sure, yeah. So I've been pleasantly surprised so far with the Biden administration's approach on China, but it's really early. And I pointed out one big difference I had where they have not, I talked about India, but in general on vaccines, they have not been supportive of trying to help the rest of the world vaccinate. And I get that there's total political reasons. I think there was an article in one of the big papers about the healthcare folks in the Biden administration really wanted to help the rest of the world and help India in particular. And the people in the White House didn't want to because they want to be perceived as helping Americans first. And that, again, as I said earlier, that I think is wrong morally and from a strategic point of view, because again, nobody gets out of this pandemic till all of us get out of this pandemic. In fact, China had that happen early on. They were sort of crowing early on in the pandemic when they got things under control, and then cases were exploding here in the United States and elsewhere, and they're saying, look at us. But then their economy, even though their official figures didn't necessarily reflect that, if you look at underlying figures and look at things like China Beige Book, their economy was having a lot of troubles in 2020 till probably maybe the fourth quarter. And that's because the rest of the world was still in a pandemic, so it's going to be the same thing with us. Our economy will start growing faster, but we won't get to full potential until the rest of the world gets out of this. And as well, the Biden administration could have easily, we were sitting on tens of millions of AstraZeneca doses that we could have easily started exporting months ago. We didn't need them. We had enough supply thanks to things that the Trump administration did originally, and now the Biden administration has improved on and done a lot of stuff to really up the supply of that. And we should be really spending a lot more money now on trying to do even more production of vaccines and vaccine ingredients. It's really the easiest cost benefit analysis in history. We should be spending billions of dollars more now to get up our production of vaccines. You can use it for the United States, but also for the rest of the world. And you'd literally be saving trillions of dollars in the economy if you did that. So spend billions to save trillions, not to mention in lots and lots of lives. So that's one of the biggest agreements with the Biden administration. My worry is that they will make agreements. So they've initially started off in a lot of ways I agree with. My worry is they'll start to make a lot of agreements and not get what they'll give away a lot of stuff without getting a lot of stuff. So we'll see what they do with on trade agreements. There's still a U.S.-China trade agreement, which again, that was focused on the trade deficit, not really not at all on opening the China market. And we still have the tariffs there, and I can see why you want to keep them on for now. You want to get some leverage to get things, but what will they really get? And will they continue to be upright talking about human rights, or will they sacrifice that because they want to get China to do stuff on climate change? And I think that would be a mistake to do that. I think you can still do stuff on climate change and work on human rights issues at the same time. So it's early. I agree with them on stuff, but I'm be interested to see where they keep going forward.
Okay.
And consistency across administrations. Good luck. Although I will say China may be the one bipartisan issue of the United States right now, right? I think Republicans want to be very difficult. Well, Republicans have very big concerns about China. Democrats have very big concerns about China. The challenge is that being concerned about China, and so a lot of Republicans just want to completely decouple. I don't want us to do things that'll make us feel good. I want us to do things that'll be effective. And so there's bipartisan support of concern of China. It'll be interesting to see when you get the details of what to do about China, if that holds. And then good luck, if you're going from a president like Trump to President Biden, and let's say, I don't know, Marjorie Williams wins next election, good luck in having consistency in foreign policy.
Okay, well, we have 3 more questions that I think we can get to in our remaining time. The first is from YP Chan. Why should China have to follow the USA liberal democracy order, which is still an experience yet to be proven in history? How about let other countries to determine what kind of government structure they want instead of telling others what to do? Would you like your neighbors to tell you how you should teach your kids?
If I was teaching my kids by beating them over the head and putting them in the basement locked up, yeah, actually I probably would want my neighbors to tell me how to teach my kids. But the answer really is, I've heard this, and I think I talk about this in my book, that some people talk about, well, China just doesn't have the right culture for a liberalized democracy. And then, so if you want to say that, then I say, well, you can just look a couple miles across the water at Taiwan, which is Chinese and is a liberalized democracy. Started out authoritarian, developed economically. As they got to different stages of economic development and different GDP per capita, they liberalized. And so I just don't think it washes. Now, I get you can't force people and tell people, you darn it, you become a liberalized country. That certainly didn't work in Iraq very well when we invaded them. But I do think you can encourage it. And I think democracy and liberalized societies have sort of been getting a bad brand over the last 4 or 5 years from both the left and the right. I think Trump was very much had an authoritarian bent, and he was often complimented authoritarians around the world. But you also get it from the left, where it's like, oh, we're not that successful. We need to figure out doing different things. And again, people forget about how much life has improved around the world and in America. Again, we have a long ways to go in America on a whole bunch of different issues, but things have actually improved in a bunch of different ways. I talked about incarceration of Blacks, long ways to go, but there's been improvements, big improvements, the reduction in poverty. I just think people are not recognizing what it was like 60 years ago as opposed to now, and what caused those improvements to happen.
Okay, thanks. There's a question from Paul Rollins on Taiwan. How do you see the Taiwan challenge unfolding over the next few years? You've talked a little bit about Taiwan, but is there anything you would add to what you've already said about, looking forward? How do you see it unfolding? Well,
it's a great question, and they're doing well, and they have challenges themselves economically, of course, like all countries do, and they're very tied into the China economy. So it'll be very interesting to see them walking the fine line and trying to resist China, trying to change them or even invade them, but keep the economic success they have, some of which is based on their close economic ties to China. I forget the exact number, but there's a lot of Taiwanese in China doing all sorts of business. So that's a challenge. And my other big worry is sometimes I feel like maybe Taiwan's at their high water market. Everything kind of goes up and down, right? So everybody loves the the Taiwan president, and they're I think the first Asian country to legalize gay marriage, and they handled the coronavirus pandemic better than probably any country in the world, although they're not doing as well yet on vaccines. But they've been very successful, and I wonder, okay, what happens if the things go down? What's going to happen domestically in Taiwan when inevitably things get worse than they are now? And how will the rest of the world treat Taiwan if they're not as successful as they are now? There's other thing we have to remember: things go in cycles, and we have ups and downs, but things will go back up again. So when they're having troubles, whether economically or on some social issue or some politics thing, you can't say, oh, Taiwan's lousy. It's just, we all go through different cycles. And the same thing with America. We went through, in my opinion, a very difficult political cycle the last 4 years. Though our economy did relatively okay with a lot of things still to fix. But we don't live in utopia. Things go up and down, and people need to keep sort of an even keel on those things.
Okay, so from Zach, are there any specific long-term policy measures that Washington State could take which wouldn't be affected by the changes in administration at the federal level? So just looking at Washington State specific policy measures.
With China, or just for our own economy, or?
I believe that they're referring to China. So sort of, given that, sort of we have, I know that states have their own initiatives in terms of just like the council and so forth. Are there initiatives or ways that the state could perhaps carry out some of your ideas or promote some of your ideas, separate from what the federal government's doing?
I'll give 3 ones, and I'll try and do it quickly since I know we're running out of time. One is, I don't believe in decoupling, so I'm all for Nora and the Washington State Department of Commerce going over to China with the trade mission, and we should continue to try and build up trade ties and business ties. So that would be 1. 2, we should continue to encourage Chinese students to study in our colleges and schools, and as well as other countries' students to come here. It's one of our great exports and one of our great assets. And then real quickly, one of my recommendations for how to improve America has to do with infrastructure, but it's not about the Biden effort to build more infrastructure. It's to tackle why it costs 2 to 3 times more to build infrastructure in America than it does to build it in Europe or Japan, with no commensurate benefits to the environment or to labor. So Washington State could take the lead and figure out, okay, why does it cost us so much and take so long to build public infrastructure? And if we can figure that out, then we help the rest of the country, and we build our state and the rest of the country better.
Okay, thanks. All right, the last question I have about technology. China is decoupling from Western technology. They use WeChat and DingTalk for everything. And when asked about Microsoft Teams chat app, they say we can't use Microsoft products. So how many products can Microsoft actually be selling to China?
Well, I mean, so that gets to the continued economic mercantilism that China is practicing. China is an innovative economy and creating all sorts of new and cool things, but they also do still steal technology and have forced technology transfer. And I should note that, and people talk about decoupling, should we decouple from China? Well, China's been decoupling from the United States and from other parts of the world for a long time. The great firewall of the internet and the preventing places like Amazon from being able to be in China successfully. Amazon is not a stupid company. They're not succeeding in China because they're a stupid company. They're succeeding because China propped up their domestic industries like Alibaba and made it impossible for places like Amazon to succeed there. And again, that's where a multilateral effort is needed. The Europe, Japan, Australia, United States, and others of like minds really need to push back on that, and if need be, try and close off our multilateral economies. China's economy is some ways bigger than the United States, but it's not bigger than the U.S., Japan, Europe, and Australia and others. They don't have as much leverage if we all work together on those things. And we should also be vocal about it. So China are all the time tweeting stuff anti-America and anti-other things. Their politicians and others can tweet, and I don't think we should kick them off Twitter, but we should continually say, hey, how come you won't let how come China can't have Twitter in there, or Facebook or other things, and how come you censor Weibo and WeChat? So we should continually be talking about that. Don't cut them off from our social platforms, other than if they break the rules, which I think they have on occasion. But we should continually be bringing that up.
Okay, I'm going to entertain another last question from YP Chan. And the reason I'm doing that is I think it's a great question. There's so much China bashing as popular sport in the USA these days. Is there anything the USA can learn from China's success in the past 40 years to fix our own problems at home? And I think, you're talking about infrastructure that might have provoked this question.
Sure, and I don't cite infrastructure costs being lower in China's because it is a different system, but I think there's plenty to learn from China. They have a much better mobile payment system than we do. For example, when I talked about they have lots of innovation in their economy, that's one of the places. So I think it's probably good to look at the way China is encouraging some technological resources there. I think it is some of their family-based efforts there, not the one-child policy, but it's sort of the cultural things. I think there's lots of things that Americans could learn from that. We could certainly look at their high-speed rail, although some of it I know people think is being overbuilt at this point, but some of the high-speed rail makes sense, and we could certainly try and learn from that, as well as from the Shinkansen in Japan and other places. There's plenty to learn from China, as there is from every other country. I think that's been one of the failings of the United States, is that too many Americans think that we do everything best. And then you have to remind them, we have slower internet speeds than a lot of countries, worse infrastructure than a lot of countries, worse ways we run our prisons than a lot of other countries. So there's all sorts of things we can learn from other countries, including from China. And I think absolutely we can learn stuff from them.
Okay, thank you so much. It's been really, really great talking to you. I will hand it back to Noor.
Okay, thanks. Thank you, Sam, and thank you, Anne. It was an excellent discussion. Thanks very much for going through all the questions, because there were some tough ones there. I think Sam, you handled them quite well. On the last one, I just say healthcare is another one, where the cost of healthcare in America is outrageous compared to most other countries. I don't think most of us would be happy with the Chinese system, but since I've experienced it myself, but it does provide healthcare at a very reasonable cost to millions and millions of people. So there's a compromise. There's a way to learn from some of their systems, I think. One thing they do is they negotiate with drug companies and say, this is what we're gonna pay for your drugs, which in America I think is something that we might have to look at sometime. Anyway, enough of my comments. You two are the experts today. Thank you very much for this very interesting session. Thank you to everyone that participated. I hope you enjoyed it. Again, we're going to take the next, I think, 2 weeks off as far as WSCRC webinars, but in the last half of May, we're going to be back talking about the hate crimes and the violence against the Asian population. And we may have one or two other, I think we may get one or two of our congressmen actually speak to us in the second half of May. So please keep an eye on our website, and thanks again, and good evening to everyone.